Leela Siddiqui.
Hi, everyone. Woo! Welcome, BookCon 2026. We are so back, and I'm so happy to see you all. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to the BookCon team for organizing this wonderful event. My name is Leela Siddiqui, and I will be moderating the spotlight on Rebecca Kuang. I'm a marketing professional, a podcast host, and an author. My gothic horror novel, The Glowing Hours, came out in February. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. And now, someone who likely needs no introduction, but just in case you're new here, Rebecca F. Kuang. All right, so let's get started. You've moved from epic fantasy to literary satire to dark academia. Which genre has been the most interesting to write?
All of them. I'm kind of a genre agnostic. I really don't like staying in one lane, and I'm actually kind of baffled by authors who just like write the same thing for their entire careers, because I feel like I have a new personality every morning when I wake up. And it's kind of up to my husband to be like, is she in a good mood? But like every genre has its set of tropes and discourses and expectations, and they fit better or worse for exploring a certain set of questions. So I'm so hungry, and I want to try writing in all of them before I'm dead. And I find it really hard to, like, every time I get close to the last 10% of a project, I'm already thinking about a new voice that I want to be writing in. But I was thinking about this since you sent me the list of questions, and I think a through line through all of my books, whether they're epic fantasy or historical fantasy or contemporary, is that a lot of them are coming-of-age novels. A lot of them involve a young person thrust into an institution or a social situation where they don't really belong, and they have to read the codes as an outsider to figure out how to navigate the space, and then they usually end up burning it down. And I think I was drawn to coming-of-age narratives because, well, I'm not 30 yet, so I was coming of age, and
Wow.
I was figuring out who I was in the world. And I think Babel, in the most literal sense, is a Bildungsroman because it's an inverted version of Oliver Twist and David Copperfield, where instead of ascending to respectable bourgeois Victorian society, the main character has a good look at what would be required of him to blend in, and then just decides he doesn't want any part of that. But yeah, I think throughout my life, I've always felt like an outsider in whatever institution I've been in, and I've been wondering, well, do I want to belong? What would I have to do? How would I have to behave in order to assimilate? And then making those tricky choices about whether those sacrifices are worth it. So if that's a genre, the critical Bildungsroman, I find that really interesting, and I'm still working within it.
Absolutely, and I think everyone here is really happy to hear that anytime you finish a book, you're already thinking of your next one. So I think I can agree with everyone that we're really excited to hear that. So you've spent a lot of time in academia, and you've mentioned in other interviews that you were inspired to write Catabasis because you realized that academia is hell. I'd love to know how much of your recent work has been inspired by your personal life.
I mean, pretty much all of my work is inspired by, well, whenever I'm having a really hard time, because I like to process anything difficult I go through into fiction because it's cheaper than therapy, and then I get paid for it. I don't have to pay the therapist for it. So with the Popverse trilogy, I was in Beijing as a 19-year-old working on a gap year and figuring out all these things that had happened to my family that I had been totally disconnected from growing up. And that was my way of processing it. Then I had a very weird year at Oxford, so I wrote Babel. And then we went into lockdown, and I was living on the internet, so I wrote Yellowface. And then we started our PhD programs, and it was idyllic in a lot of ways. I was also massively depressed, and like we were going through some really difficult personal things, Benny and I, so that's what led to Catabasis. And I think it's such a good way to, I'm told that this is a really weird way to think about like personal hardship, but it's how I think about it. Every time I'm like on the ground sobbing and I feel like I can't get up, there's this like part of me that splinters off and is just really curious and is asking questions like, wow, how do we feel right now? How would we describe this if a character were feeling this way? Like, what are the turns of phrase that would capture, I don't know, this combination of grief and suffocation? And literally, like, what are the mechanics of your sobbing? Like, where in the body does the sadness sit? How is it coming out? Like, the rawness of the throat, the pain behind the eyes. And it's just always chronicling and always grabbing these details for future use. And this is either like an insane way to process your own life as art, or it's just a great coping mechanism because it makes you legible to yourself, and you put yourself on a page and hope that somebody who's been experiencing something similar will find comfort in that. So I'm saying all this in the context of Taipei Story, which comes out in September, and I know we'll chat more about that. But I've been through a lot of loss in the last few years. My grandfather passed away a few years ago. My grandmother died at the start of this year. So I've been thinking a lot about grief and how you write through it, and also how to be funny about it. I think silence is the worst thing about grief, when people are trying to be so polite and not say anything offensive and not hurt your feelings. But I'd rather people just make offensive jokes all the time when I'm grieving, because then at least it breaks the ice and you're able to breathe, and laughter takes the weight off. So yeah, I've been thinking about writing through that specific personal experience, and I'm excited to share it with people.
Thank you. I promise we'll get to Taipei Story. Just a couple more questions. So actually, let me sidetrack a little. I'm referring to your last novel as Catabasis.
Whatever, man.
It's whatever? Okay, you don't care? Because you said
Catabasis,
Catabasis. Yeah,
Catabasis.
okay.
I'm tired.
All right. There are many different interpretations of Catabasis. You can look at it as a critique of toxic academia, or a satire of the very same thing, or a young woman's journey of personal growth and survival. And because I'm a bit of a sap, I actually personally saw it as a love story. I'd love to know what your favorite interpretation is and why.
I mean, I think it's a love story too. It is like really explicitly about two people overcoming the worst about themselves to connect. But I think my main interpretation of Catabasis, in the most literal way, it's not just a journey to the physical underworld. The setting is hell, but the hell really exists in the minds of the characters. It's a novel about chronic illness and mental illness, and about suicide. It's a novel about reaching your personal worst and not knowing if you can go on, and finding the strength to do so anyways. Because the text that I think posed the question I was trying to answer with Catabasis is why you should continue to live in your body. Because there's this, I think, like really seductive Platonic conception of death, and it comes from the Phaedo, which is the dialogue where Socrates is sentenced to death for basically being too annoying, and Plato is like talking through the sock puppet of Socrates in the Phaedo, and his friends are like, Socrates, go into exile instead, or flee, don't die, we'll miss you. And Socrates is like, no, they were right, I was being too annoying, and I should respect the laws of Athens, so I should kill myself. And then he's like, but that's fine, because dying just brings you closer to the gods. He has this concept of mind-body dualism where the mind is the wonderful thing that does the perceiving and the observing and judging, the activity that it does philosophy. And if you're just the mind, you would be closer to the gods because it's the body that is this meat sack is the source of all vice and suffering. Like, bodies can be ill, bodies can be deformed, horrible things can happen to a body, and bodies are the source of desires that lead to sins like gluttony or adultery, etc. And I think a lot of people, it's not just me, have really fraught relationships to their bodies. Like, we really wish we could escape them, whether it's because of illness or trauma, or I think that's a fantasy for so many. Like, if I could leave this body behind, maybe the pain would stop. And I think the question that fundamentally Catabasis is trying to answer is how do you find a way forward to keep living and think of your body as a source of pleasure and joy and a part of your mind rather than something you're trying to escape. So maybe it's a story about loving yourself, and that's how it's a love story.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I was thinking more about Peter because you just described him so delectably that I thought, oh, girl, you gotta get with this man. But yes, I can also understand the loving yourself as well. You're one of the most prolific authors working today. Curious writer minds, mine including, would love to know more about your writing process and how you manage getting through that all-important first draft.
I once read this piece of writing advice from like an older established male writer, and some like student had asked him like, how do I get through this? And he was like, the most important thing you'll ever learn is you're completely on your own. And I sort of do feel like that's true for writing. Like, there are lots of things you can say about process and craft and technique, but at the end of the day, like, it's just you, like, wrestling with your own mind in a quiet room. And certainly for me, like, there is no template, there is no predictable outcome, there's no process that's been the same from book to book. It's just me with this, like, mess of a draft. And sometimes it comes together in a matter of months. The first draft of The Poppy War, I think, took 3 months to a draft, and then 6 months to something that I was sending out to literary agents. Babel took over a year because I was doing so much research for it, and I only spoke some of the languages involved, so I had to like pull in a lot of other experts. Catabasis took like maybe a year total, but it was interrupted because I was taking my qualifying exams, and also I got married, so I was like, I don't want to work that year. And Yellowface took like 1 month to get to that first draft, because it was, I think, like, it more than any of my other books, it plopped into my head fully formed, and I knew the ending and I knew the character arcs, and I was a digital native, so I didn't have to do that much extra research to figure out all the ways people can be nasty on Twitter. But I think in terms of phases of the project, at least like that is the same from book to book. It starts with an idea that's like sufficiently bothersome that I keep thinking about it and turning it over my head, and it spirals out into a bunch of different lines of inquiry. And then I just jump down those rabbit holes, and it's like a scavenging period where I just read a lot of monographs in different fields. Right now I'm working on this long, like, multi-POV, multi-timeline novel about art and fascism across the 20th century. And there's 5 different main characters and 5 different timelines. So every day I wake up and I'm like, it's time to become an expert on Wagner and French politics after the Franco-Prussian War. And then the next day, I'm bored of that, so I'm like, it is time to think about Chinese exchange students in Tokyo in the 1930s and the ways in which their political protests were undercut by the fact that they were trying to learn constitutional systems of governance from the very nation that was occupying them. And then I get bored of that, and I'm like, the Cambodian genocide. And yeah, I really appreciate approach it like I'm writing a dissertation, except for unlike a dissertation, it's just all the fun bits. And I'm there reaching for those threads, those little nuggets of fascinating human encounters or just information that I think would be fun to spin into a story. And then I come back with like my scavenged basket of wild mushrooms. I call that the vomit draft, the zero draft, where it's just a bunch of ideas for scenes and set pieces and little anchors across history, but there's not a clear narrative through line yet. And then I have to impose that. And then we get to like a very messy first draft that has, I think, like a suggestion of a story. And the rest of the process is just whittling and figuring out what the narrative through line is, what the plot twists are, the best way to sequence everything. And then by the end of it, maybe the characters get names and physical descriptions, but I really think about that last. I think about setting and theme and historical inquiry before I think about what color anybody's eyes are. So it's all like balls on sticks moving around through the 20th century until the final detailed pass. And then that horrible mess goes to my agent, who's like, dear God. And then she imposes some sense on it, and then it goes to my editor, and then years later, it reaches you guys.
So it's, oh, we should clap for that. Come on. So your process is completely unique to you, is what I'm hearing, because you know, when you're first drafting a novel, you just need to get it out of you. But it seems like your process isn't completely streamlined, but so personal and unique to you. You're just able to bring the whole story together at the end, right?
I think I just like to read a lot, and I have a lot of questions. The other night, so 2 nights ago, my husband is now a doctor of... Yeah, he passed his dissertation defense of philosophy, so if you have a heart attack, I can do nothing for you. And we were celebrating, and it was wonderful, and then I came home, and then I decided to have a gummy, but only like but I'm a lightweight, so it was like 2.5 milligrams. And all it ever does is make me kind of sleepy, but I think I find everything really curious, and then I was just scrolling through images of findings from archaeological digs in Saudi Arabia and like across Mesopotamia, and I was like, oh my God. And that's how my husband found me, like asleep with the phone open to like a fertility goddess, and I like forgot everything that I learned. There is no project that emerges from this, but I just like, the world is so shiny and crackly, and I want to chew on all of it. And I think the way I digest it is spinning it into a fun story to tell somebody else. So that's naturally how my entire process goes. I'm like a magpie collecting, like stealing other people's spare change, and then creating a nest of like used tampons and spare change.
I cannot get that image out of my head now. Thank you. I think that sense of curiosity really does show through in your work, and it's something that I appreciate about your work as well. I want to go back to Yellowface. There's a line from the main character where she mentions a novel that perfectly straddles the line between speculative and commercial. And I remember thinking, what is that perfect novel to you?
Okay, I have 3. The first is Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go, which is a science fiction novel, but people are so snooty about genre, and they're like speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy. It's for like nerds. That's not serious literature. And I'm like, you gave Nobel Prizes to Kazuo Ishiguro and Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Like, this is crazy. And it's so heartfelt and heartbreaking. And I think the really understated exposition and world building are so well done. It leaves you with more answers than questions, but you feel like deep in your gut the inhumanity and like the suffocating hopelessness of the characters throughout, and it's just amazing. The next book is David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas, which has a incredible film adaptation. It it's so frustrating to me that the adaptation flopped when it came out, because it's one of my favorite movies ever, and I think it's by the Wachowskis. I think it's really well done. And it's one of the templates I'm thinking about as I write this novel about fascism in the 20th century, because it cuts between different characters across like wildly different milieus, but there's this like recurring, I mean, it's about like reincarnation and eternal recurrence and the patterns of lives repeating over centuries, and I'm interested in those historical patterns and the idea that you can fall in love with somebody, see the same face again and again over every civilization. So that's an amazing book. And then my third recommendation, which is more commercial than it is speculative, is The Count of Monte Cristo. It has such a weird, Count of Monte Cristo and Les Mis have such an odd reputation for being inaccessible classics just because they're long, but they were their contemporary equivalent of like pulp writers, right? Like these are extremely compelling, like accessible, easy to read chapter installments that leave you like gasping for the next chapter. Especially The Count of Monte Cristo, which is just like so addictive and fun in every way. So if you've been put off by its length, this is a sign to you to finally tackle it.
Great. Well, I hope everyone's adding that to their Goodreads shelf. So a lot of readers really fell in love with the characters in Babel. Did you have a favorite character to write, or one who surprised you the most as you were working on the book?
You know the meme that's like, I love all of my children, Robin, Rummy, Victoire, and lettuce? I feel that way about the characters in Babel. A lot of them are mirrored on close friends of mine, especially people with like different attitudes towards revolution and colonialism, who come from different linguistic heritages. Like Babel is the work of a village. Like the majority of languages referenced and the cultures discussed are not mine. So I had to pull in experts from other fields and friends who live in different languages, or at least friends with parents who live in different languages. Like I had like somebody's like mom was calling me to tell me about Sanskrit. So certainly like the three main characters are just labors of love that represent like all of the different cultures that make up my relationships in my life, and it feels so special to look back and remember, the people I was talking to in 2020. But there was one character who really surprised me with their popularity after the book came out, and that's Griffin. I think I really enjoy killing older brothers. I have an older brother. We have a really good relationship. But in the Popverse trilogy, there are like really fraught elder sibling relationships, and there's always this tension between the firstborn who kind of crumbled under the weight of expectation, and then the one who came after them. So there's Naja and his older brother who gets turned into dumplings, and Rin and Alton, and he's more like a cousin, but he has that older brother role in her life. So I think that's just a trope I enjoy so much. I carried it over to Babel, and Griffin is like a warped photo negative of Robin, where everything went wrong. He was bad at being a translator, bad at being an Oxford student, kind of has like a rancid personality, dropped out, faked his death, joined the Hermes Society. And I tried to write him in this kind of like, well, so he's like the artful dodger character, right? So if Babel is an inverted Oliver Twist, then Griffin, the one that pulls him towards the resistance movement, is that bad influence, the figure on the fringes of society. And I gave him this like ratty, smelly overcoat, and he's just like not a fun person to talk to, and people are in love with him. And then the book came out, and I listened to the audiobook, and the narrator's done a fantastic job, but he puts on this like really sexy drawl when he does Griffin's voice. He's like, let's go on a walk now. Oh, brother, you're an idiot. And I'm like, oh my goodness. and I had to stop listening. So, yeah, I think Griffin really surprised me. If I ever do a Babel sequel, which no, I said I wouldn't work on until I became fluent in French, and now my French is pretty good. I just am not an expert in the American Civil War yet, so I have to master that, because the natural direction of the Babel sequel is like a Godfather 2 type structure, where it's Griffin during the Burmese Wars for independence and Victoire in the future fighting the American Civil War, and they're speaking to each other across time. I guess I've thought about the sequel for a long time. But yeah, those are the characters it would center on, and that's what it would be about. And it does surprise me, because those were the two characters that gripped me. Certainly Griffin. Actually, I've always liked Victoire, but he gripped me the least in the early draft.
I'm going to get the audiobook, and I'm going to get a glass of wine. I'm going to listen to it. So finally, y'all, you have a new book out in September called Taipei Story. I know, I'm so excited. Can you tell us about what inspired the story and what you'd like readers to come away with once they've read it?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a happy origin story for a book. I was in Taipei studying at an intensive language program, and my grandfather passed away that summer. And it was a big shock to me, because I grew up speaking Chinese, and then I stopped once we moved to the US, and then I became very committed later in college to regaining my Chinese, and I'm fluent again now. I can read novels in Chinese, I do research in Chinese, and I'm very proud of that. But there's a part of me that was so anxious about talking to my grandparents and asking about their stories and lives and experiences, because I didn't feel like I was as sophisticated and nuanced and adult in Chinese as I was in English. So I was putting off these conversations until a day when I felt perfect and fluent, but that day was obviously never going to come, because my life isn't in China. I'm not in that immersive environment. My life is in an Anglophone context, and then he died. So now I don't get to have that conversation, and I only get to ask my questions to empty space. So I started writing this novel as, really, it started as journal entries to process everything that my family was going through. But then I was able to reframe it through the lens of fiction and create a character who's very much not me. She's a college freshman. She's much more naive. She's like a lovable idiot. But she goes through a similar loss, and she's also trying to answer the question of what happens when that fantasy of diaspora reconnection and reunion isn't possible anymore. What if you can never really go home? What if you cannot rejoin your extended family or feel fully connected to your heritage? What do you do then? But I do want to say, it's a really funny book. Again, I think grief is funny. I think it's important to be able to laugh at loss and not just to linger in these awkward silences where you're so afraid of saying the wrong thing that you don't say anything at all. I think the main message of the book is it's better to make that, to reach out in an imperfect way and to make that mistake, use the wrong phrase, have flat tones, have an accent, but just speak, because otherwise I think culturally we're retreating into these shells of perfection where everybody's so afraid of being canceled or being mocked or putting their feet in their mouth that we just don't even communicate about important issues anymore. So Taipei's story is an argument for being the butt of the joke and saying the idiotic thing.
I think it's really... I think it's really interesting when you're a writer of the diaspora. Your primary sources often are your grandparents and your elders. They tend to be in different countries. They tend to be far away, and then they're much older and they pass away. So how do you kind of navigate that that need for that primary resource and then that loss as well?
Well, so the last few months have been very interesting for me because I've just been learning a lot more family history than has ever been revealed to me. And sometimes like people don't want to share their family histories either, right? Like we all think like, oh, if only I'd listened to my mom when she was talking about her childhood, or if only I'd like listened to my grandparents' experiences of the war, I'd be more connected. But sometimes they don't want to talk about that. Sometimes they're like, no, we've moved on. Like we're looking at the future, and this doesn't concern you, so stop asking about it. And all this really painful stuff came out. Like so this is something that's explored in Taipei story, but I lost most of my mother's side of the family in the Cambodian genocide. And when my mother was growing up, she grew up in mainland China. Her father, my grandfather, had left Cambodia for the mainland as a teenager to go to school, and he didn't know it was impossible to get clear news across borders, right? Because China was under like communist control. It was very difficult to move in between regimes. So there was just this big open question mark of what had happened to his parents and his sister. And so my mother, like eventually they found out that they died because my mother's father's sister, so my great aunt, I guess, she had escaped to a refugee camp, and she wrote him and said, well, our parents are dead and my sons are dead. And that's how he found out. And when she was growing up, my mom used to sit outside and look at planes in the sky, and she would think, oh, maybe those are my grandparents, like finally coming to visit. Maybe I'll finally get to meet them. And that was never going to happen. And obviously, like, you don't want to talk about that. Like, you move on with your life, and you try to put all this loss behind you, but it was just sitting there, and it had never been shared with us. And I really wanted to know what my grandparents had come from and what they'd been to. So finally, all of this came out, and he said it's okay to write about. But, you know, it doesn't make it so that it never happened. I think the only purpose of writing about it is preserving the fact, and also letting somebody else know who's been through something similar, like, you know, this is a shared experience. This is something that other families have gone through. So it's something I'm still working through. Like, it's obviously very painful to think about and talk about.
Thank you. So you do a lot of research for your work. I know you mentioned that earlier as well. What's the most random or unexpected or unhinged thing you've fallen down a research rabbit hole about that didn't make it into a book?
Okay, I want to talk about the Tokyo War trials. And this is research for the book I'm currently working on, but this is like all this background context that is not directly relevant to the plot, so it's probably not going to make it in, but I find it fascinating. Okay, so Japan did a lot of bad things during World War II. And then after the Japanese surrender, the Allied powers were like, we're going to hold a war trial, sort of like Nuremberg, Asia edition, so that we can properly document these crimes, and hopefully it never happens again, and we can like judge Japan in the eyes of history. So they assemble this court, and there's judges from like sort of a random list of countries. It was purportedly the list of countries that had received the Japanese surrender, but they didn't invite anybody from South Korea. And they also didn't invite anybody from India or the Philippines until the Asian countries were like, this is kind of fucked up because Japan did really bad things to us, so I think we should be there. So that's how they got started. And then the trials begin, and it's just like a gross miscarriage of justice in every way, because they can't even figure out like what jurisdiction they have to be trying Japan. They also can't figure out what exact crimes they're charging them for. So at one point, like the prosecution was like, it's crimes because it was murder. you went to war, and Pearl Harbor, we're convicting you of murder. And Japan was like, that was an act of warfare, and you're allowed to kill people in wars. So they were trying to define like exactly what is the problem with starting a war and killing people while you're fighting that war. And one of the lines was like, no aggressive wars, no wars of like colonial expansion or imperial aggression, no, basically only wars of self-defense, no wars where you go into another country and invade and take a bunch of their stuff. And then like Great Britain and the US were like, oh, we don't know how we feel about that line, because we do that all the time. And then the Russians were like, we are happy with that. And they were like, oh, what the fuck? Like, what do you mean? And the Russian judge was like, well, all of our wars are wars of liberation against capitalism. So when we do invasive wars, it's wars of self-defense. We're helping them defend themselves against their own capitalist regimes. So we've never done aggressive war. And the Americans were like, I just don't know that works. So it was failure on that front. And then on the day that they brought in the Japanese generals to testify about like war crimes like the Nanjing massacre, it was another like hilarious miscarriage of justice, because they had like mountains of proof that these mass rapes and murders had happened, but because they were only trying like very high-level generals and decision makers, their standard of proof was a conspiracy to do all of these war crimes, as opposed to like letting the war crimes happen. And then you would have these like farcical encounters where the Japanese generals would get on the stand and they'd be like, so like a lot of people died, like you just massacred civilians, and they were like, no, we didn't. And they'd be like, okay, but there are bodies, so you did. And they're like, well, we can't have done it because that was against our code, and our instructions were don't kill the civilians, so I don't see how it can be possible that there are bodies. And they're like, okay, well, like somebody killed all these people. And they're like, yeah, like maybe like it happened by accident, like we didn't tell our troops to do it, but maybe they did it, like we're carried away in the moment, but it wasn't like a top-down decision. It wasn't a conspiracy. And the prosecution was like, okay. So I'm just like aghast at how we have such a hard time pointing to a historical atrocity and calling it what it is, as opposed to jumping through all this legalese mumbo-jumbo that satisfies like very selfish geopolitical interests in the moment. And yeah, I've been thinking about this for a long time. Very little of that is going to make it into the narrative of this book, but I just can't stop. It frustrates me so much.
It's incredibly relevant to what's happening today, for sure. I want to go back to when we talked about the all-important first draft and research again. So there's some writers who need to get the draft out first and then research. And then there's some writers that need to research first. And then there's some writers who are researching throughout. So what's your research plus draft process?
Yeah, I get a version of this question a lot from my creative writing students. I teach undergrads, and they are really concerned with like, when can I stop research? Like, what is an appropriate amount to do before I start the draft? And I always tell them, like, if you treat research as a chore that has to be done before you start drafting, it's like every other form of procrastination where if I have a writing deadline, magically my whole house will be cleaned. I'll do all the vacuuming, all the dishes, I'll even fold all the laundry and take out the compost, even though my household deal is I never touch the compost. And I think research can easily become like that, where you're like, oh, I can't start writing yet. Like, I have to figure out what currency system they were using in 1732. And I found, at least for me, the only way to stop the research process from going on forever is just to do them side by side. So I'll often open writing sessions this way, where for the first hour I just read through historical monographs, and I think about like like right now, I'm reading about like gallery exhibitions in Tokyo in 1937 because I'm very interested in the development of fascist aesthetics and how it operates as like hypnotic cultural forces that over time gets everybody on board with projects of military expansion. And it's great because I start from a place of curiosity and I'm reading, but as I read, I get kernels of ideas for scenes, and every time something pops out to me, I stop and I write like 200 words around that. If there's an artist or a painting I find really fascinating, I'll stop and build like the whole scene, or even like the turning point of that chapter around like this historically grounded thing. Because if it's interesting enough in a dry monograph to catch my attention, then it's certainly going to be interesting enough in dramatized fashion.
That's incredible that you don't touch your compost. It's stinky and gross. So what's a terrible idea for a book that you're still kind of tempted to write?
Okay, most of my terrible ideas are actually becoming books. So, but here's something that I will probably never work on because it's stupid. Have you guys seen that movie? It's called like Afterlife. It's the Elizabeth Olsen one with the two husbands. And like, oh, I won't spoil it for you if you haven't seen it. There's a similar setup. But so Benny's my husband, and a joke that we really like to play is, or a game we like to play is like, what are ridiculous circumstances that would never happen to us, but if they did, how would you react? And we're both like, how many years would have to pass for you to find a new love before I died? And I was like, if you die, I will just die as well of heartbreak, so that's not a problem for me. And he's like, oh, that's the expectation? Okay. But a more interesting scenario is like, if I was actually a superhero, but the enemy was so dangerous that any association with me would be almost fatal to him. And it works vice versa. We've done both situations where like he's a superhero. And it's like, okay, so the only way that I could break his heart and go fight this horrible enemy without him like always looking for me is to fake my death. So imagine if like I faked my death and he thought I died and I was really off like fighting this battle to save the world. And under those circumstances, he might remarry after like a 20 years or so. And then imagine I won, and then I could reveal my identity and return home. And I showed up in his new home with his new wife and their kids, and I was like, baby, I'm back. And it's like, what would you do then? Who would you choose? Your new wife of 20 years? Or I guess your new wife of 6 months, because you were mourning for 20 years. Or your first love, who faked her death but actually is still alive and is a superhero. And he was like, oh my God, it'd be like you came to pick me up from daycare. I'd be like, okay, bye, and then just come with you. And I was like, okay, and would you like keep a relationship with her? And he was like, I would call her on Christmas and her birthday. And I was like, what would you say to her? And he was like, happy birthday. Like I don't know. Like if I like met a new man and then Benny showed up, like I would be maybe I can have my superhero boyfriend and also like the father of my children. And this is like such a stupid, we talk about it all the time. And like the plots get more intricate. Like imagine if his new wife, let's call her Rachel. Imagine if he and Rachel got together because she was also mourning the death of her husband. But he was a superhero. And I made it out. But then I was like, by the way, Benny, like Rachel's husband died. Like actually, but like a couple months ago during our big fight, not like 20 years ago, like she thought. Like how would we handle that? How would we break it to Rachel?
That is incredible. I need to see it. I need to read it. I think choose your own adventure format would be perfect for this. Oh my goodness.
Happy birthday, Rachel.
All right, well, so a lot of y'all submitted questions ahead of time. So thank you so much. I'm going to move into audience questions. So from Maria, what is your favorite part of your writing process? Is it brainstorming the idea, researching the history or topic, such as linguistics and Catabasis, or structuring characters or arcs?
I mean, it's a mix of everything. It's more of a feeling than a defined state, but there is a moment where I can be reading through like Heidegger's essays on art, which I am now because thinking a lot about fascists. And he like says something that resonates with this Japanese painting, that resonates with a piece of Wagner's music, and it's just like history is shining at me, and it's like begging for somebody to make these connections and build a narrative around it. And I felt this way while I was writing Babel as well. When I became interested in silver as the physical medium because I was interested in silver capitalism, because that was the currency that everybody was fighting wars over in the early 19th century. And then I was like, oh, silver bars, that could be interesting, silver translation. And then I'm looking into the history of silver and how it's mined and smelted in South America. And then it's smelted using mercury, and mercury is the Roman name for Hermes, who's the Greek god of translation and travel and messengers. And in that case also, like, everything just clicked at once, and it felt less like I was inventing this fantasy device for the purposes of artifice to make the story, have a motor, and more like it's already pre-written. It's in like the primordial soup of the universe, and my role is just to solidify that and pull out that concept and put it on the page. And I get this feeling maybe once every few days when I'm working through a new set of sources or jumping down a new rabbit hole, and like I get really giddy. I start dancing around my office, and then I start screaming like, I'm writing and it's like that guy on the beach with the piano and it's on fire. And yeah, that's my favorite part.
The piano on fire, I love it. From Grace, are there any future series you'll be working on soon?
I guess the Babel sequel would be the closest thing, which I really would like to do at some point. I think I just have to figure out some things about time and space. There's a middle grade or young adult series I really want to do, but I think writing for children is a lot harder than writing for adults. I think, like, technically it is really impressive. I was rereading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and it's really short. It's like 100 pages, and it just whizzes through world building and action. And I'm sort of agog. Like, I don't know how you, like, I really like to take my time with exposition. Like, I like to spend like 10 pages on irrigation systems and translation theory. So if I can figure out that brevity and like elegance of delivery, I would like to write like a series for younger readers about art history and the Louvre and the skeletons in the catacombs. But I think there's like a lot of training involved before I get there.
Absolutely. This is from Melina. What are your thoughts on writing a multiple POV novel, and might there be one in the future?
Yes, Melina, that's the book I'm working on right now. I'll tell you the 5 different POVs. So this is my next fantasy novel. It's a retelling of Faust, but again, instead of the devil, or I guess like embodied in the devil, it's about the development of fascist ideologies from the late 19th century onwards. And I realized in order to tell this story properly, I needed that broad sense of time. I needed to embed myself in decades, like across the century, and not just do a cross section of one interesting year or moment. So the 5 characters are a German composer who meets the devil in the trenches during the, or not technically trenches, but on a field with a bunch of dead bodies during the Franco-Prussian War. And then the next timeline is about a Japanese propaganda artist who befriends a Chinese law student in the 1930s before the outbreak of hostilities between Japan and China that kicks off the Second Sino-Japanese War. The third timeline is 2 French literature students at the University of Strasbourg right before the Nazi occupation. The fourth timeline is in the 60s and then 70s, a Cambodian student who becomes radicalized in Paris and then becomes one of the foot soldiers of the Cambodian genocide. And then the final timeline is a Cambodian refugee turned folk singer who is coming of age and popularity during the Reagan era. So we go from the Franco-Prussian War to Reagan, and there, I think that's like a really good slice of time to think about how fascism pervades culture and society in surprising and often insidious ways.
Wow. Well, Melina, you got your wish. This is from Uma. What has been the most challenging aspect of story building for you, and how did you overcome it?
I think I don't like bodies, and this is coming back to the central frustration of Catabasis, which is I have a problem with recognizing faces. It takes me a long, because I'm just really not that interested in physically how a person presents. All of my characters come to me first as a tangled nest of ideas and ideologies, and they're often developed to present an opposing or an inflected viewpoint on something that's different from important ways from how the main character thinks about things. But people are really interested in hair color and eye color and birthday. And for years, I was like, why is everybody asking me when this character's birthday is? And people would always ask about the cast of the Poppy War trilogy, like, when's their birthday? And I was like, they don't have a Gregorian calendar, so I don't know. And then I realized it's because they're doing horoscopes. But whatever. And I was just like, and this is a big flaw, not thinking about how characters are embodied and how they might have physical attraction to each other, and how their embodiment affects their motives and their ways of moving through the world. And it's something I'm working on getting better at. There's a scene in Taipei story where they have sex. This is huge for me, because, yeah, it's just something I'd never that kind of physical interaction was not something I was interested in exploring through prose. But now I'm actually, college sex is really hilarious and really painful and cringe, and everybody can act in just the dumbest ways. So there is this really cringe passage in the middle of the Taipei story that involves a hand job in a hot tub, and I'm very proud of that passage.
I can't wait for the Rebecca F. Kuang sex scene, y'all. It's time. It's time.
One of the lines involved is, "The only way out is through."
So on brand. I love it. This is an interesting question. This is also from Uma. As it pertains to the Poppy War series, how challenging was it to craft your magic system, and how did you find it difficult to contrast that to Western cultures depicted in the story?
Well, the big secret of the Poppy War trilogy is that almost nothing about it felt that hard, because I didn't know all the ways in which you could go wrong. I think a lot about being 19 and writing my first novel and breaking all the rules because I didn't know that there were rules, and also being a debut author at a specific point in literary history where there is this explosion of non-Western fantasies. Fonda Lee's novel Jade City came out right before I was writing The Poppy War. Ken Liu's The Dandelion Dynasty series was coming out. N.K. Jemisin's The Fifth Season had just won like 2 Hugos. So to teenage me, there wasn't this assumption that all epic fantasy has to be Western, it has to look like this. Rather, like, as I was joining literary circles and reading about, like, contemporary fantasy trends in publishing, like, all anybody was talking about was these really inventive, like, non-white, non-Western authors who were, and I didn't even know they were breaking all the rules. I just thought, like, that's what good fantasy looks like, so I'm gonna do that. So I had the benefit of like total ignorance about the trends that those figures had been pushing against for decades, and all the doors were opened for me, and I just thought, well, I want to do shamanism and Chinese history and magic, and I want to nuke fantasy Japan, which is like the metaphorical ending of the first Poppy War book, and I just did it because I was like, you know, anybody else could do it, and it really didn't occur to me that this was pushing boundaries until the books were coming out and people were talking about like what a departure they were from established literary traditions. But yeah, I didn't open those doors, like other people opened those doors, and I just got to run at full speed through them.
All right. From Kylie, what's something you believed about writing when you first started that you've since unlearned?
That's a fantastic question. Here's something else that I try to convey to my undergrads within the first few weeks of class. I used to think that if writing felt easy, if it felt smooth and enjoyable, that was good writing. And that if it felt hard, if I felt writer's block, if every word felt like pulling teeth, then that was bad writing. That's completely backwards. There's this wonderful book on craft called Several Short Sentences About Writing by Verlin Klinkenborg. That's just his name. And in the first chapter, he dismantles our assumptions about flow and genius and a good reading experience. He says we're so attached to the idea that like you might be struck by divine inspiration and fully feel a scene, and all of the words will just gush out of you, and that's a successful writing session. But actually, when everything's just pouring out of you without much conscious thought or frustration, you're just using volunteer words for volunteer thoughts. Volunteer words are the words that are easily volunteering themselves. And volunteer thoughts are the ones that come to you because you're mimicking what you've seen floating around. You're repeating cliches and expressions that you've read before in the air, that you've heard on the internet or on TV, and you're not really asking, you're just repeating the discourse of the moment instead of asking, what is the new experience I'm trying to capture and articulate and convey to somebody else? So basically, you're functioning like ChatGPT. But when writing is really hard is when you detach yourself from everything that's volunteering itself to you and asking, like, what really am I trying to pin down? What is the perfect word for this? And you're sifting through all the possible ways to articulate the sense that you know is real and is sitting in your head, but you've never heard anybody else say out loud before. And then when you finally get that perfect turn of phrase, that perfect rhythm, that word that's on the tip of your tongue, but it takes you like an hour to finally arrive at, like, that's good writing, and it feels really hard because you're working. So yeah, there's lots of cultural areas where you can apply this framework, but I think things that are slick and smooth and fast and easy, we should be very suspicious of, and things that just feel like tearing your hair out are like representations of the deep effort it takes to understand ourselves and be known to others. So I used to think I was failing if I didn't pump out like 1,000 words in an hour. And sometimes there are mornings where I only get out 2 sentences, and they're really good sentences.
All right, well, I apologize I couldn't get through all the questions. We are just at time. So thank you, Rebecca, for being here. Answering all of these burning questions. And thank you so much, everyone, for attending this Q&A. Rebecca will be signing copies of her books right after this at the author autographing table 30 in Hall 1AB, and will be here later today and tomorrow for more signings, so please check the BookCon schedule. Thank you all.
One more time, BookCon, make some noise for RF Kuang.